HRF is the Human Rights Foundation. And the special nature of HRF is that we are a human rights organization focused on helping people who live under tyranny or dictatorship. A lot of these countries and conflicts you just never hear about. So you have a lot of causes in the world that, for whatever reason, just don't get the same attention as a handful of others. HRF was created to fill the gap, and it was created to, be there for people who are living in sort of the darkest environments.
Alex, good to see you, man. How are you?
Good to see you, Peter.
All right, get this mic ready. All right. Well, so first time I heard you on my new show.
Yeah, it's a new era.
A new era. Okay, so there will be people listening who are new, who won't know who you are, and the work you do, the really important work you do. So I know we did this probably 6 years ago. Do you want to give people a background to what you do at the HRF and what the HRF does?
Mm-hmm. Sure. HRF is the Human Rights Foundation. And the special nature of HRF is that we are a human rights organization focused on helping people who live under tyranny or dictatorship. And that's extremely important for a variety of reasons. I first started getting involved as almost a student back in 2007. And we've grown our operations and programs around the world ever since, with this guiding focus on, again, helping people who live under authoritarian regimes. And, some of it's kind of obvious, like dictatorships are bad for humanity, and it's important that we try to help people who live under them. But there's a structural component as well that makes me fired up about what I do and very, very honored to help in this mission. And that's the general idea that if you think about the human rights space as an industry, let's say there's $1 billion a year being spent on human rights. We're somewhere in that ballpark, right? Something like 80 to 90% of all that funding is spent inside Western countries. And that makes sense because the philanthropists come from those countries. People who are donating, cultures that have a culture of donating for human rights causes tend to come from the United States, Europe, places like that. So what you have is a structural deficit where you have billions of people living under dictatorships and very, very little funding. So for example, China, world's largest country. And I would say that there's maximum $10 million a year spent on Chinese human rights stuff, maybe a lot less. For a Chinese human rights organization, a $10,000 grant is like a really big deal. Whereas for a Western organization like Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch, I mean, they've got, as like $100 million budgets, right? So what's happened over time is, and I understand why, I'm empathetic to this, that people want to help in their own backyard and they want to help their own communities, and that's totally fine. But what's happened is a structural issue where, because it's sort of dangerous to be a powerful, wealthy person from a dictatorship and to help the opposition, right? Like you'll get your stuff ransacked, stolen, you'll get silenced, you'll get imprisoned. I mean, look at Jimmy Lai in Hong Kong, right? He used his power and his wealth to try and help activism, and he's in prison now. So because of all these factors that prevent sort of the more wealthy in dictatorships from helping democracy movements, human rights activists, again, you have this structural deficit. So HRF was created to fill the gap, and it was created to, be there for people who are living in sort of the darkest environments. And so is your job to empower activists within countries? Yeah, I mean, we see ourselves as catalysts, right? So we identify people on the ground in these places doing amazing work, and we basically say, how can we help you, right? And we have a range of programs to help, right? So they're the ones who know their country the best. They know what they need, and they know what's going to work, right? So we're kind of like a middleman, if you will. So we'll say, do the young people in your country need fellowships? Do the young leaders need to learn how to be better organizers? Are there organizations that need grants? Is funding an issue? Do you need media training? Do you need to understand how to raise money? So a lot of our programs are strategic or tactical. There's also assistance that's needed legally. In many cases, a regime will put one of its opponents in prison, and we can say a lot of things about global international law, but it does sort of still work in this way where, for example, you can put pressure on these sort of international judicial bodies, and you can actually get people out of prison. We've worked on many, many such cases over the span of our lifetime since we were created in 2005 and helped free many, many people. A very prominent one that we were involved in recently was the liberation of Vladimir Kara-Murza from prison in Russia, for example. So we have a legal team that helps with that sort of thing in terms of helping put pressure on governments to free political prisoners. And we also have event series around the world where we put these individuals, these very brave individuals who need to be heard in front of a room of people who can hear and then who can help, right? So our flagship event series is called the Oslo Freedom Forum, and it's kind of like Davos, but flipped on its head. At Davos, it's like all the rich people are on stage and the activists are outside freezing cold trying to protest against what's happening inside. The Oslo Freedom Forum, the activists are on the stage and the super rich people are being quiet and listening in the audience. Sort of the goal was to flip the model. And we've been doing that for, going on 16 years now. And we've heard the most incredible stories on stage there, and those people end up getting a lot of help. So again, our goal is to, figure out how to help inside countries that have, very repressive rulers, and learn how we can empower civil society. And a lot of my role there has been on the technology side since the beginning. One of the first things I did was help empower the Cuban underground library movement. So in Cuba, they have, communist dictatorship government. They don't permit free speech or any independent political parties. And before, about 10 years ago, they didn't have internet. So what we would do is we would send in, contraband information, movies, books, ebooks. Some of it was on CDs that were smuggled in by friends of mine who were Latin American, and they could freely travel to Cuba. One of my first projects as an intern in 2007 was putting together backpacks that would be taken into Cuba to distribute to the underground library movement. And it might be movies like V for Vendetta, like dubbed into Spanish. Or it might be things like Animal Farm, but in Spanish. And people would basically read or watch these things and then have discussion groups inside their homes. And that was one of the only ways they could get access to information that wasn't approved by the communist government. Later, I worked a lot on the North Korea program. So you have a similar situation where you have like a hermetically sealed off people, especially 15 years ago, with no access to the internet. And they're completely brainwashed into thinking that they are in paradise and everywhere else is a disaster. In reality, of course, it's the opposite. So you can see how badly people can get gaslit without access to free information. And what we did is we figured out different ways using technology of getting information in, whether it be using balloons to float information over the DMZ into North Korea when the wind is blowing north. I participated in many such of those balloon launches.
Was that thumb drives for freedom?
Yeah, it was flash drives for freedom.
Flash drives for freedom.
But before we even launched Flash Drives for Freedom, which was something that we created in 2016, we were involved in helping these North Korean groups. And these are basically people who fled North Korea and then wanted to help the people they left behind. So they would send in notes, information, dollar bills, in bags on balloons. They would run radio broadcasts that could be picked up by radios inside the country. And they would send in a ton of stuff over the border with China. There's like a bustling trade routes, a network of trade routes on the northern border of North Korea, on the border with China. And you can pay people off to bring in all kinds of things. So there's different ways to get information into North Korea. These days, it's been quite successful in terms of outside information has totally penetrated North Korea, and it's helped create many, many revolutions in people's minds, right? So things have started to change inside the country, and we now run programs both to get information in, but almost more importantly now these days to get information out. We have a whole thing called NK Insider that we run, which is basically a newspaper written by people inside North Korea. It's fascinating. So we've always been interested in how technology can be asymmetric and can help people who are being oppressed. So that's what led me ultimately to my career where I am now, where I'm using another technology, Bitcoin, to liberate people. But that's got a lot of context behind it. 15 years of working with people under really difficult political environments in understanding that technology is one of the things that can really move the needle.
Directionally, is the goal always to spark some kind of internal revolution that brings down the dictatorships, or is there more nuance to it? Is it also just to support people who are living in very difficult circumstances?
Well, speaking for myself, I think that people inside each country will make the decision about what's best for them. Vladimir Kara-Murza, actually, he would always say, Russians will handle Russia. Leave us alone. But the one thing you can do is stop supporting our leader. And this was 10, 15 years ago when Putin was seen as a glamorous leader. And George W. Bush was like, I looked him in the eye and he was a great person. And there was a lot of international support for Putin before the mask came off and he did what he started to do, right? And Kara-Murza's point was like, just stop supporting our dictators. We'll do the rest. And I really resonate with that. I think that that's the right way, is to let people steer their own destiny, but help them if they ask for it, right? And I think that's a big role we can play in the West, is listening. And then if they want help, let's answer the call. So for example, Iran, we have no idea how to chart the course forward there with regard to human freedom, especially for freedom for women. But we can listen. And over the years, I learned that people inside Iran, for example, I know we'll get more into it later, but they were very thirsty to learn about Bitcoin because their currency had collapsed. They had no way to get access to outside markets. They were sanctioned, walled off, etc. So we helped support translation of texts, and people were able to start interacting and be free from the state. So I think the long-term goal is to empower individuals to be sovereign in all these places. And then hopefully over time, the accumulation of that is more freedom in these places. I hesitate to endorse any sort of revolutionary regime change type stuff, especially with violence. It usually doesn't work out well. If you actually look at the history of violent revolutions versus nonviolent ones over the last, let's say, century plus, there's some really good work that's been done on this, but basically nonviolent movements are way more successful than violent revolutions. And it may be counterintuitive, but you have to actually go look at it. Nonviolent movements are just much more successful in creating stable democratic societies versus violent revolutions. Violent revolutions often are hijacked by another dictator. And we've seen this time and time again around the world, right? You have a horribly oppressive system. Maybe it's colonialism. In the case of, for example, Robert Mugabe, he comes in as a hero for liberating his country from colonial rule, right? You have Rhodesia, awful. And then, okay, great, we have this guy coming in to set up a new state. But he ends up turning into a horribly corrupt dictator. Same thing in Cuba. You have the Castros, right? So Fidel comes in and liberates his people from a sort of a brutal dictator. Well, guess what? He becomes the dictator. And this happens time and time again when there's a violent revolution. They can work, but it's very rare. And when you look at the countless numbers of people power, peaceful movements around the world, whether you looked at the Philippines or the Baltics or Serbia or so many other places, a lot of times it worked, and it was a sea change from a very fear-based oppressive society to something where people had a lot of hope, and they built a new kind of country. So I would want to kind of do what I can to assist peaceful movements, for sure.
The examples you give there, say with Mugabe and Castro, is it because the way they come in doesn't come with the necessary reforms within the country, like the democratic reforms and institutions that you need to ensure they can't become a dictator themselves? Yeah,
it's interesting that we do this. Yesterday, a Nobel Prize was given to the authors of a sort of a thesis. This guy, Darren Acemoglu, he's a Turkish economist, and some of his colleagues won the Nobel Prize for one of the Nobel Prizes in economic sciences for essentially this idea that institutions are what have differentiated why nations fail and why others succeed. And there's certainly something to that. I do agree in obviously in some regard. Look at North and South Korea. You have democratic institutions like free speech, property rights, and that ends up making a lot of the difference. I mean, look, at one point you had two Koreas, both of them dictatorial. But the one in the South started introducing some reforms. And over time, those reforms led to protests and a free society that ended up having free speech and property rights. And you look at a outer space photo from outer space of the peninsula today, and one is thriving and bursting with productivity and energy, and it gives birth to Nobel Prizes and Oscar-winning films and culture that's dominating the world, and amazing technology that's in all of our pockets, and we drive the cars, and Korean culture is incredible. At the same time, north of the border, the main export is human suffering. So I think there's a lot to be said for, let's say, structural differences. And it's true, like in the cases of Cuba and Zimbabwe, there wasn't great structure. But at the end of the day, these individuals were flawed, corrupt individuals that, in the absence of that structure, they created their own tyranny. And that I just, to your point, I guess, when you look at the numbers and you look at the countless times you've seen regime change, let's say, usually it's a poor result if it's a violent change, usually. Nice. And oftentimes there's, let's say, like the military comes back in. We saw this after the Arab Spring in a lot of these places too, where you just don't quite get the job done. But I would encourage people to take a look. I think the study is done out of the University of Colorado. Very, very, very interesting stuff. But anyway, the point is, my hope would be to look at ways where we can empower people peacefully so that they can make their own decisions and take their fate into their own hands. I think one of the biggest problems in, let's say, humanitarianism or human rights writ large over the last century has been this idea that we should go in and fix things. Like white man's burden thing. I mean, it's not, even if it works once in a while, I just don't think it's a smart way to do things. You empower local people in local communities. They know best, and they'll get the job done. So that's kind of the theory of change. And to that end, I think the work we do is important because it gives people a voice. It gives people support, funds, tactics, technology, and maybe most importantly, solidarity. A lot of people we work with, they say the hardest part is not knowing if anybody's listening, not knowing if anybody else is standing with you in solidarity, especially if they're isolated, not knowing if anyone has their back. And look, there's a couple causes that are very popular today, one way or the other, for people to have a position on. Russia-Ukraine might be one, Israel-Palestine might be one, but there are countless causes that are very tough, with a lot of conflict and a lot of trauma and a lot of victims, where it's not popular to have a position, right? Like Sudan's a great example. Sudan's probably the largest humanitarian human rights disaster happening right now out of all of them, just in terms of number of human beings affected. Nobody has a position on Sudan. I mean, it's not something you ever really read about in the news, right? Like, when's the last time you've seen a front page story about it?
I think I saw something yesterday. Was it a crisis of cholera they have there at the moment now?
Yeah.
But it was like a buried article.
Well, there was one piece in The Guardian a few days ago that said
maybe that was
something like, this is the only the reason this cause is notable is because nobody cares about it. And it's just, look, I mean, I guess it's just not, it's not necessarily like a place where there's been a lot of history of Western intervention, oil, terrorism. I'm not sure quite why, but a lot of these countries and conflicts, you just never hear about. Like Burma's another good one. There's been a crazy, peaceful protest that turned into a civil war in Burma that's been happening. I mean, Yemen basically always gets written off. I mean, very few people could tell you what's happening there. Syria even. Syria's like, it's not like it's got any better from when we were talking about it quite a bit, like 10 years ago. It's only gotten worse. There's daily airstrikes every day in Syria by the Russians and the Iranians. So you have a lot of causes in the world that, for whatever reason, just don't get the same attention as a handful of others. And it's not to say that the ones that do get a lot of attention aren't worth it. Like, it's definitely worth talking about what's happening in Ukraine and Palestine for sure. But I just find it interesting that the world is split in this way. And I think what HRF can really do is help, especially in those instances where it's like conflicts that don't get other people's attention. So we kind of do a lot in cases of smaller countries, smaller conflicts, smaller movements and we try to figure out how we can help. We don't want to try to double spend, right? We don't want to like do necessarily more where everybody else is sort of already helping. We were kind of built to fill the gap in a way. And I think that's reflected in our programs in terms of some of the legal advocacy that like no one else is really doing, some of the tech stuff that no one else was really doing today, to this day. I mean, the North Korea stuff is not really touched. It's crazy. It's one of the world's worst human rights crises, and there's just barely any funds spent. I think we are the largest NGO in the world in terms of spending funds on North Korean defector organizations, and we're not even spending that much. I mean, I'm proud that we're doing it, but it's like very low six figures a year that we're spending on grants and support for North Korean defector groups, but nobody else is doing it. So it's something that is kind of our theory of change. Again, it's like filling the gaps, finding places where there isn't enough attention and energy, and taking advantage of our resources and deploying them accordingly. And that led, I think, to the Bitcoin stuff as well, because again, nobody was doing it. You had this huge opportunity where everybody's money's broken and everybody's bank accounts are getting frozen and people can't move money around. And we were like, okay, we can do education in this area and have a massive outsized impact. So that's kind of the goal, again, is to figure out how we can have the biggest leverage in this big struggle for human rights.
So does that mean there's been a kind of significant evolution in the mission or the way you operate over, I mean, did you say 2007? So
yeah,
you've been
I've been
there
since 2007.
17 years.
Yeah.
Has there been significant change then?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say there's been significant change at all in the mission. I mean, the mission remains the same.
But the tactics?
Figuring out how to help people live under authoritarianism. But yeah, I mean, tactics, I think we've always tried to be creative. Our founder, Thor Halvorsen, he like kind of launched us in New York instead of in Washington, which I think was really smart. We didn't want to be in the swamp. Like we didn't want to be another lobbying organization. I think one of the worst things that's actually happened to human rights recently is that it's become in some cases, human rights activism has devolved into like begging the U.S. government to do one thing or another. Look, quite literally, it's like you'll see activists and they spend all their time on trying to get the U.S. government to do this or that. And I get it. I appreciate it. The U.S. government is the most powerful force in the world. So, having them support a cause or take away from a cause is really important. Like, honestly, might be the single most important thing in the context of, let's say, what's happening to the Palestinians, for example. But on the other hand, it's like, is that really activism? Begging a government to do one thing or another. So I was happy that we were based in New York and more kind of focused on the private sector, on business and art and finance and culture. And that's where we've kind of focused on, is trying to engage private individuals, families, communities, as opposed to lobbying. And I think, again, I empathize with why so much human rights activism is lobbying, but I'm glad we don't focus on that. And I'm very happy. I don't go to DC very often. Like, look, if someone wants me to come in and talk, I'll think about it. But I want to work peer to peer with activists around the world. I don't want to be like routed through a government.
Is that mean you still have both an internal and external job, in that you have to, and you want to support activists within a country, you want to enable them, help them, but at the same time you have a communications job, so people within kind of Western liberal democracies fully understand what's happening, both so maybe one, they support you, obviously you want support, but secondly, to create that additional kind of pressure that exists, that public opinion. Because I've learned so much from yourself and the HRF. I've learned about issues in various countries I didn't know existed, and that's helped me form better opinions about these various global issues. Yeah,
well, it's about creating a two-way conversation where the individuals that we work with in these countries can educate us, inform us, inspire us, challenge us, and then we can figure out how to give back. Right? We're both receiving. Let's say me, I'm receiving information. I'm learning about how the world works from these people, my friends. And it's making me rich in terms of information and perspective and knowledge and wisdom. And then I want to give back, right? I want to give back. So I want to figure out how I can help. But it starts with the first step, which is informing yourself. And that's why I think the work we do is so interesting. And like, especially the conference, the Oslo Freedom Forum, which I hope people get a chance to check out. I call it a bubble breaking machine, because you go there and it just completely breaks your bubble of what you thought the world was like. And it shows you parts of the world you didn't even know existed. And it shows you things happening in the world that you weren't really quite sure were even possible. So I find it fascinating. It usually is jarring for some people, but ultimately I think it's quite inspirational because it shows the indefatigable nature of human spirit. I mean, you get people up there who've been crushed within an inch of their life, and they're up there telling you their story and how they're not going to quit. We've seen like these two women we had last year who are survivors of the Uyghur prison camps in China, where the Chinese government has been waging a genocide to try and get rid of a people, basically. Like the Chinese government's goal has been to erase the Muslim minority culture in the northwest part of China. That's sort of the definition of genocide is getting rid of a people, right? Getting rid of a population. And their goal has been to just wipe out the Muslim majority culture in that part of their quote unquote country. Of course, it was colonial at the beginning, right? It was the Han Chinese coming in and colonizing this area, but their goal is to change people's language, their names, marry off the women to the Han Chinese, change the identity cards on the kids so it's Han Chinese, make sure that any public displays of Islam are either tightly controlled or eliminated. So a lot of the mosques were shut. If you wore a beard, you could go to a prison camp. If you were caught with a Quran, you could go to a prison camp. So basically, they call it a harmonization, but like purification. But what they're doing is they're sort of rinsing the land of this type of person and replacing it with their own. Now, it's not maybe the same kind of genocide you might see elsewhere in terms of, bombing and outright destruction.
It's like a cultural genocide.
But it achieves it in a very powerful and effective way.
Yeah,
and it's maybe less shocking, but it is so effective, and that's what's going to happen. That's what's happened. I mean, you basically have now a region that's been sort of rinsed of its identity, and that was the goal from the beginning. Was a colonial kind of idea of we're going to come in and we're going to make this place Chinese, and that's what has happened. But we heard testimony from two amazingly brave women who had been through the camps and had firsthand experience, and that's a shocking thing to hear on a stage in a world where like a lot of your stuff comes from China, like, and you have maybe you're morally conflicted about it, but like a lot of the things you wear, a lot of the technology you use comes from this society that has this underbelly, right? And of course, you might have heard about what's happened in Hong Kong or Tibet or generally speaking, free speech and censorship there, but the Uyghur part is probably the worst. So, showing people that, or, showing people what it's like in, again, like our speakers have covered everywhere from Gaza to Yemen to Venezuela to Cuba to West Papua, which is a perfect example because it's, again, a place that's undergoing significant trauma at a global level, but no one's even heard of it. And it's basically the western half of the island of New Guinea. It's colonized by the Indonesians ever since the 1960s. It's a police state. There's no rights. There's no democratic anything. And the Indonesians wanted it because of the resources. The world's largest gold mine is there, operated by an American company called Freeport. And it's the world's largest gold copper mine. And just this past week, the Indonesian government has had to send in thousands of troops to quell protests and uprisings from the locals who are completely different than the Javanese. They look different. They speak differently. They have different languages. They have a totally different culture. They have nothing in common really with people from the island of Java, which is the culture that is now let's say the government of Indonesia, and they don't want to give up their land, so they're fighting back, and it's a brutal thing to see. It's kind of like the plot of Avatar, but like happening in real life. I mean, seriously, it's like exactly the same. Like this imperial power comes in, they have all these resources and guns, and people with connection to the land are thrown out or killed because of the empire's interest in resources. It's a really crazy thing. But again, we've had those voices on our stage, and those aren't the kind of things you'll hear about in the media in the West, really. So we continue to try and shine a light in dark places, and in my mind, it's really important work. It's not perfectly overlapping with everybody's interests. We're going to kind of focus on these particular kind of regimes. It doesn't mean that that democracies don't do bad things. They do a lot of bad things. But I think by holding a sort of a mission and a focus to only helping in the cases of authoritarian structures, you do something quite special, and you do something that's very needed. And I like to see us as complementary to all of the other activism going on, right? So we fill like a gap and we fill a need. And I think that all the work I've been doing with technology has been sort of born out of that.
The humble bee, a keystone species crucial to the survival of Earth's inhabitants. Here's how things would look if bees vanished. And here's how they'd look if humans vanished. But imagine if instead we became a keystone species by doing things the right way, by taking responsibility for our actions and becoming the solution. Iron mines the world's most responsible currency the right way. Because the future depends on it.
Is there a form of external activism whereby, for example, if you empower someone like me to understand, I would continue to make similar content and try and educate people locally, say, where I live on some of these issues? I'll give you a great example. We have what's considered an immigration issue at the moment. We have a lot of people coming into the UK, and that has become a political football. People are discussing the immigration issue, what a disgrace it is, and you hear people complain about this. Without taking a opinion either side, one of the things I've been able to do with information you've given me is explain to them why people are coming here, and explain to them structural adjustment, which I learned from you, and explain to them that we've impoverished these countries through the programs that we've implemented, so we can essentially continue to get free shit. I think you told. Did you explain that we've exported our inflation to other countries?
Yeah.
And so I've explained to them, this is why people are leaving these countries. They're fleeing these countries because they want a better life. And so having that kind of information, does that help in putting pressure on governments locally? Perhaps maybe that companies in the UK won't do business with companies from the Uyghur region, as an example. Yeah,
and I think you see some of that. And to your point, a lot of my own personal work has been examining the dynamics behind the dictators, like who's supporting them, where are they getting their money from, and in many cases, it's Western organizations like the IMF or the World Bank. But the outcome remains the same. You have crushed, starved people who are starved of food, starved of information, starved of freedom, and they need to go somewhere else, and they end up coming back to the West. I mean, this is what you see. So, I think humanizing them and empathizing with their story is very important, regardless of what kind of policy you're going to create afterwards. I think that it will be a better policy if it's informed by the facts of why are these people fleeing these countries. And I think people would be maybe surprised, to your point, to know that they have essentially a role in it, right? But look, I think direct action at the government level is very hard to achieve. And we're happy to take wins here or there, but that's not necessarily what we're doing here. We're not like pushing the British government to do something different. I do see...
You're sparking other individuals who maybe do it themselves.
Absolutely. I do see like the impact of our work having an impact on government officials, absolutely, without question. But that's a byproduct of what we're doing. What we're trying to do is empower like this global peer-to-peer network of activists and make them as strong as they can be and as resilient as they can be. And there are a lot of good byproducts of that work. I would say the chief among them being informing people, educating people about what's going on, and then those people will take that information and do all kinds of cool things with it. I mean, we've had people who attend our events or get involved with our work write best-selling books about this stuff, make movies that have changed the world. I'll give an example. Jamal Khashoggi, who was a Saudi-American journalist, was murdered by the Saudi government in Turkey in a very grisly way. And he had actually come to the Oslo Freedom Forum before this, the year before he was killed. And he was part of our network. And what ended up happening is we were able to inspire someone who's very talented, a filmmaker named Brian Fogel, who had made an Oscar-winning film about Russian doping, Icarus.
Yeah, I met him at your event in New York.
Yeah. So Brian ended up becoming interested in our work, and he ended up creating a film about Jamal called The Dissident, which became the most widely distributed documentary ever on demand, on streaming across the world. And that's sort of like one outcome of the work we can have on others, right? So while we're doing our work to empower individuals and civil society groups in difficult places, yes, we want the world to know about that. And we do, I think, a pretty good job of sharing that information. And again, that inspires artists, filmmakers, journalists. Look at our friend Ian Burrell. Who's just on your show recently. We've been working with him for decades, or only not decades, but almost 2 decades on sharing ideas and exchanging information. And I mean, he's been running with it. So, and some of that is political, right? And politicians do listen to what we have to say, and hopefully they make a change. But that's not our goal. Our goal is to empower, peer-to-peer networks of individuals and activists. So that remains the North Star.
Trajectory-wise, are we heading more authoritarian globally, or do you think we're heading towards more freedom? Because I feel like right now this feels, in my lifetime, it feels like a time where we're at most conflict, and we are having I feel like there's serious risks in democracy in various parts of the world. I mean, we've seen democracy fall in Turkey, for example. Yeah.
It's chopping. I mean, look, the reality is that if we think of democracy as like relatively open societies where people have free speech and property rights and can participate in their governments, we saw a huge boom in democratic societies and in democracy, obviously in the late 80s with the fall of the Soviet Union. In the 90s, there was another big wave in Latin America, Africa, etc. But in the mid-2000s, around getting closer to 2010, the boom subsided. And there's been some really big stagnation. Now, there's been some victories too, like the dictator in Thailand is gone, and that society's been opened up a little bit in the last few years, and there's a few there's a few victories here and there, but generally speaking, we're kind of chopping right now. We're going sideways, and it's not quite clear, where we go from here. I think on the one hand, I'm really concerned. On the other hand, it's not. It's not like there is some moment in the past where it was better. I think that's where people get a little lost. Like, I mean, people are upset with, for example, what the U.S. government's doing today in the Middle East. Well, think about 20 years ago. What we did was so insane and crazy, and people have kind of forgotten about it. So, like, there's always something upsetting that one of our governments is doing abroad, and there's always, a tragic war or conflict abroad. I think what's been happening recently is that social media has amplified a lot of this. So it's made it seem more close to us, and it's made it seem more part of our lives, right? And it's taken a toll, and it feels like it's worse than it's ever been, right? Sometimes, because you go and these social media platforms, the big ones run by tech companies, are designed to outrage you. It's just a series of car crashes to get your attention. So we get extra worked up about natural disasters, wars, conflicts. The reality is we've always had these things, right? And the humans have done their best to survive and move on. But it makes it trickier when you're just being bombarded with videos and photos. It's not that it's necessarily worse than it was before, but we're a lot closer to it. And I hope that moves people. I really do. It means necessarily it's going to feel a little darker because we're going to learn a little bit more about what's been out there. I mean, trust me, the world was extremely dark before the age of social media. It's just that maybe we didn't see it, right? So now we're like a little bit more aware, maybe, of what's going on. You have, genocides these days where people are like tweeting, "I don't know if I'm going to survive tonight," And obviously we didn't have that in 1970s during, any number of large conflicts or what was happening, insane stuff that Kissinger was doing in Cambodia and Vietnam. we didn't have people live tweeting that we could directly connect with, that we'd been following personally, right? Maybe on Instagram or wherever you're following some account. And then all of a sudden they're like, I don't know if I'm going to survive. So the bad stuff's always been happening, but the way that the social media apparatus has been sort of built up has made it a lot more personal. Does that make sense to you?
Like it does.
It's brought it right into our lives, and it, the most important thing, you got to stay optimistic, because it can be very easy to become jaded and pessimistic in the face of all this stuff. Like it's tragic. Like you look geopolitically around the world. I mean, we're filming this in the middle of October. Just the other day, I think yesterday, the Chinese government, the CCP, encircled Taiwan in a show of force. And we don't know how much longer Taiwan's going to be an independent nation. Like my organization's been a huge supporter of Taiwan. We've done Oslo Freedom Forums in Taiwan. We've supported the Taiwanese people however much we can. But I mean, it feels terminal there. Like it's very scary what's happening there. And then, who's going to stand up for the Taiwanese if the Chinese take the island? It's tough. It's a tough one to think about. Ukraine is very difficult to think about. I mean, yes, there's been some wins and victories by the Ukrainian side, but Russia's just a much larger country with a lot more resources, and it's a dictatorship, and they can force people to do stuff. It seems clear to me that that's going to kind of grind into a stalemate where you have a kind of like a DMZ type division in the eastern part of Ukraine, and Russia's going to steal the eastern regions, and those are resource-packed regions that have tons of iron ore and steel-making capabilities and all kinds of things. And that was the goal, was to take land and people. And it seems like he's going to succeed in some regard. And then the other hotspot is Israel-Palestine. And what we're watching happen there is Israel become more of a rogue state, more of a isolated internationally. There's European countries now that are not selling weapons anymore to Israel, that are going to stop trading with Israel because of what the Netanyahu government is doing in Gaza. Very clear war crimes in Lebanon, in Gaza, and even in the West Bank. So you have kind of like a rogue state happening there. So these are all really dark times for people, because especially these three conflicts in particular, I think are going to be all over the news and all over people's timelines, and they have been. And it's not going in the right direction for freedom in any of these places, and it doesn't really feel like there's a way out, right? And it can be so depressing. So the critical thing is to find a way where you feel like maybe you can make a little bit of an impact, and hold on to that and keep pushing forward. Because over the long run, I think we're going to win, and I think that the world is going to be in a much better place in 100 years than it is today. So it's about long-term thinking.
That social media part is interesting, because you're totally right. It's obviously brought it to the just right in front of you. I mean, you will see crazy things like a drone killing a soldier in Ukraine. You're seeing the front lines of war. Wild. You're seeing horrific things. But you've also got this other thing where most people are being co-opted into having to have an opinion.
Yes.
And
pressured to have one opinion or another.
Yeah, and that, I think that comes down to maybe the echo chambers they live in, or their political ideology. But I'm fucking amazed at the opinions that people hold at some points. I've seen, Dave Rubin, I remember with the Gaza conflict kicked off, he openly tweeted that he looks forward to the Israeli government glassing Gaza. And I was like, well, hold on a second. Hold on. How can you have that kind of opinion? But then that reverberates around and other people start to share that opinion.
It's dehumanization.
Yeah, it is.
And in all three of the cases I've mentioned, you're going to see that, right? So the Chinese government will dehumanize Taiwan to its own people, so that when they try to go take Taiwan, the people they don't really react. They dehumanized the Hong Kongers, the ones who fought back, right? These were traitors, these were criminals, these were troublemakers. So that the average Chinese family, when they're watching the news and they're learning about, we're taking Hong Kong over by force, they think it's a good thing, right? They're trained to believe it's a good thing. And you see the same sort of dehumanization through media in the Ukraine-Russia theater. I mean, obviously the Russians are using their media to brainwash their own people into thinking that the Ukrainians are like, Nazis and, Nazis, basically, which is incredibly crazy. The president's Jewish, it's an unbelievable attempt at gaslighting. But when you're on media every day telling your people that these people are Nazis, then you're going to be more sympathetic to the war effort, right? And then, of course, in the Israel Palestine conflict, it's the same thing. I mean, when you've been told your whole life that Palestinians are terrorists and nothing but terrorists, then it's easier for you to accept glass in Gaza or something like that. If you really think they're all bad, then it's easier for you to accept. So it's all been about, and I use these three examples, geopolitical examples, because they're probably the most relevant to people and the most kind of triggering in one way or the other. But they all rely on dehumanization, and what is gradually happening relies on dehumanization. So the most important thing we can do, honestly, is humanize people and be empathetic. Try to be curious. Try to learn from the other side. Let's say you have a particularly strong opinion on, you really feel like Taiwan is part of China. Well, maybe you should listen to some Taiwanese people. Maybe you really feel like Ukraine is part of Russia. Well, maybe you should sit down and talk to some Ukrainians, right? Maybe you really feel like Israel should just plow through Gaza. Well, maybe you should sit down and talk to some Palestinians. So, people have these really strong belief systems, and it's so important to humanize the other. And only when we humanize the other can we actually have a better world. It's so, so important. So just to conclude, going back to like the mission of what we're doing is trying to humanize stories around the world of people who are oppressed. I mean, that's at the end of the day what the goal is.
Yeah. And I guess one of those things is also trying to get people to care, because you can put the stories out there. I mean, I care, I read them, but these aren't front page stories. These aren't, a lot of the time, the content that people are consuming is, I don't know, it's, I pick up papers in the UK, well, I read online, and I don't see these stories.
Well,
so it's a hard sell to get into people.
The media takes parts of the story, right? But the like grinding personal suffering that's happening is often left out, right? And the on-the-ground activity is often left out. I mean, you'll hear a lot of stories about negotiations at the highest level between maybe the Russians and the Ukrainians, or you'll hear, negotiations are happening between Hamas and Israel or something like that, or some sort of militaristic viewpoint on what's happening in the Taiwan Strait or something like that. But those are typically the headlines. But there's not as often. There's some, but there's not as often the human stories. So I would just encourage people to look for those and to try to make peer-to-peer connections to people in these places and challenge your own opinions. I mean, I think that's absolutely critical in this day and age when we're just inundated by bias, media narratives and constructs that have a very strong bias.
I mean, you hold pretty strong opinions on all of this, and I've spoken to you about all of this, and felt guided by you at times. It must therefore be frustrating when you see people, quite prominent public people, hold what would be, you and I would consider controversial opinions on these topics, but actually can be quite mainstream opinions held.
Yeah, I mean, look, I've been surprised at, again, to use these three examples, I've been surprised at the number of people who feel like, who are dominant in the Western media, who feel like, hey, Taiwan should just give up, and it's inevitable. That's a tough one to hear over and over again. Because again, if you normalize it, it's going to happen, right? Same thing in the Ukrainian case. I mean, especially on social media, among what Elon's kind of pushing, and a lot of libertarians are pushing this idea that like NATO triggered the war, or Putin was just in self-defense, or any of this nonsense. I mean, that's become very normalized among a lot of people. It's just really unfortunate. And then in the last case, I mean, this just general idea that Israel's this like knight in shining armor, and we need to go save Netanyahu, and he's got his back up against the wall, and all his opponents are terrorists. And I mean, a lot of people believe that. It's crazy. So
is that the success of exporting propaganda? I
mean, in some ways, yeah. I mean, the Chinese, the Russians, and the Israelis have done very well in communications and in pushing their particular agenda in different parts of the world. And it's worked. I mean, it's worked really well. But look, I'm not here to like push my personal opinion. I just think people should try to reach out to the other side and empathize. I mean, look, just push back against myself. Like I've been trying to talk to Russians or to Russian speakers. Like I interviewed someone from Crimea, and he was like not thrilled about what Ukraine was doing. But at the end of the day, he was like, Putin definitely invaded Ukraine, but he had his own perspective on being a Russian speaker in that region. That was important for me to get. So I mean, I still ultimately sort of disagree with the perspective, but it's good to hear. Like you need to enrich yourself with as many perspectives as possible. If you're just listening to what you believe in and nothing else, like it's blinkered thinking. It's going to lead to an incomplete view of the world.
Yeah, I find it wild. We're still fighting over portions of land and willing to kill.
Land is the only thing. Land is about the scarcest thing there is,
Sure.
We're not making any more.
I would like more land next to my house, but I'm not going to kill my neighbor. But people are so willing to start wars that leads to the deaths of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. I mean, it's pure evil to me, but I just don't understand how people have the capability to do that.
It's part of human nature ever since we started to form civilizations.
But we've evolved more. We've been enlightened.
Yeah.
We've had deep philosophical discussions. I believe certainly amongst certain groups of people, we've developed a more tolerant, humanist.
Yeah, no,
approach.
It's true. I mean, look, like if you look at the world, there are vast parts of the world that don't have large-scale violence right now, whereas previously, that wasn't necessarily the case. I hate to call this the most peaceful time ever because it's obviously brutal in many aspects, but we're trending towards more peace as we have more economic interactivity between people. But that's a very simplistic kind of juvenile black and white view of the world. Oh, it's getting more peaceful. Obviously not for a lot of folks. So I think ultimately long term, humans are inarguably getting more wise, more healthy, living longer, being more connected. These aren't. It's not possible to argue that versus 250 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. I mean, think about life expectancies. Think about our inability to fight disease. Think about our practices when it came to just enslaving the masses and treating women like property. I mean, these were just basic matters of life, for very, very long stretches of time. Even just inability to communicate. Now we have software and translations, and I think we're moving in the right direction, which makes these wars and conflicts and atrocities so much sadder. Is that we don't, it feels like we should be above them by now, right? It's like, but it's like vestiges of what we've been doing for thousands of years, and it's going to take a long, long time for them to be eliminated, if ever. But there are inevitable trends again that we are, we are becoming more advanced in many ways, and I think that's something to hold on to, for sure. Yeah, you have to be positive. You can't like black pill yourself. It's not a good idea, right?
Yeah, I understand, but I see how people get drawn into being black pilled.
Yeah, I get it, but you need to harness that and then figure out how you can do something positive. You got to remain inspired. Nothing will come of being black pilled. Like it doesn't help.
Well, I think people can feel helpless.
Sure.
Like what can they do?
Well, that's why what I do is look. If it sounds weird, I guess, for someone listening who's listening from a generic kind of general purpose interest in what is Peter talking about? Who guests is he having on? I'm a general interest viewer. If I come from Peter's previous world where he's talking about Bitcoin all the time, but I really feel like if we didn't have Bitcoin, I would have a lot less hope. I really would be more black-pilled. But finally, we have like this global technology that can't be corrupted and can't be stopped, and it doesn't do what governments want it to do, and it can get in the hands of people that otherwise would be left alone and isolated. And it gives me tremendous hope. So to whatever extent I can keep advancing Bitcoin adoption and other technologies that are sort of symbiotic with Bitcoin, and we can keep advancing people's personal freedoms anywhere, that's absolutely worth all of my attention and time. And I will do whatever I can to keep doing that. And it's infectious, like the momentum we have right now, actually, despite all of the, brutality that's assaulting our news feeds and newspapers when we open our eyes every day. We have this kind of hidden weapon. We have this secret power, and that's Bitcoin. And it's spreading, man. And it's spreading like wildfire. And it's going to change everything. I mean, I'm sure, your listeners have heard this a million times from all the other guests, but it's true. Like, it's going to change everything. It's going to change how nation states interact with each other. It's going to change how communities interact with each other. It's going to change how people interact with their governments. And most importantly, it's going to change how people interact with other people globally. It gives us a parallel construct that removes us from this old sort of nation state thing where we are products of our country and our country sort of owns us and we're kind of like stuck in our country. I think it's really going to liberate us from that paradigm. And it's really quite exciting. And it can bankrupt some of the worst things we do. I think it really can. As it continues to evolve and grow and continues to erode and chip away at central banking and the KYC regime and all these things, like I think it can make for a more inclusionary world that's a lot more collaborative and a lot less exploitative. These are speculative things that will take many, many decades, I think, but it gives us something to really hope for. And for what it's worth today, it's already such an important tool for all the people I've mentioned. Like, regardless of if you're being occupied or you've been cut off from this financial system for this reason, or you're living in a country where you can't vote for your own government, at least you can have the best money in the world, and no one can stop. No one can stop you from doing that. So it gives me a lot of hope in an otherwise very, very dark time.
Well, the digital component of this is also super interesting because obviously the historical context of oppression was traditionally through violence.
Sure.
But the advancement of technology has given tyrannical states the ability to oppress through the use of digital technology. But at the same time, it's opened up this range of freedom technologies. There's almost like a technological battle now.
Yeah, it's sort of, there's two sides to the coin, but yeah, I mean, look, it's allowed governments to have incredible spying powers that any dictator in history would be so jealous of. Like, what the Chinese government can do to its people every day is something that, Mao or Lenin could only dream of in their wildest dreams, right? This idea of having omniscient surveillance over everybody and being able to auto-censor with algorithms that are sophistically complicated and powerful, and being able to have micro-control over society is unreal. Further, the ability to gaslight and propagandize people by sort of selectively censoring things. I mean, what they've been experimenting with is unbelievable, and other countries have different degrees of it. It's maybe not quite as extreme in other countries, but there's definitely a bit of it everywhere, right? And it's growing in a quiet way. Like the normalization of cameras everywhere, the normalization of giving your data up to third parties and governments, the normalization of using digital money instead of physical paper money that preserved privacy and freedom, the creeping normalization and computerization and digitization and electronification of our lives had been pushing us very clearly towards a state of like 1984 control. That was where we were going had there not been for the cypherpunks. And they've given us like hope. They've given us a new direction. And there's like 3 technologies that I really think are going to help save us from that inevitable, inexorable drift towards like a dystopia. One of them, of course, is Bitcoin, and that's the financial freedom component that a lot of your guests have heard quite a bit about. This idea that we can have this unstoppable economic network that anybody can plug into and not have to ask governments for permission is mind-blowing and very important. The second one is Nostr, which I really do believe is a way for us to recreate the internet in a way where we're in much more control. So today, when you log into YouTube owns you. You can't take your followers from YouTube and go over to Instagram or to TikTok. No, you're stuck in what's called a golden prison, right?
But there's more than that. There's the acceptable, unacceptable topics to be discussed on YouTube. We've had people be demonetized, videos removed as well.
I just mean like you might have a million different gripes about YouTube, but as a content creator on there, you don't own your data. You're the product actually, right? On these big websites, whether it be Meta's products or Google's products or YouTube or TikTok or X or any of the Chinese products. Like the point is that like you are the product and you don't own your data and you don't have control over moving it around. Nostr is a completely different idea. Nostr is like you can have any number of set of identities that you create with essentially a public and a private key. Think username and password. And you can log into one client that does one thing and you can be there. And then you can, if you don't like it, you can try a different one. And you can move in and you can move your followers and your preferences with you as you cross all these different platforms. It's totally mind-blowing, and you can choose your own algorithm. So, on X today, you have like that simple choice, right? You can either be on the like, basically the algorithm tab or the like your followers tab, right? Which I'm sure is even tweaked a little bit. But the point is you don't have a choice. Like you can either do one or the other. On Nostr, you can decide. You can have no algorithms. You can do, top posts in the last, 24 hours. You can do ones that are most zapped. You can do all kinds of different things. And we're just at the beginning of that. You'll be able to do topical. You'll be able to do anything you want. And you'll decide, okay? You will decide. And I think that's so, so important. And it really takes the power back into the hands of people. It'll totally change the way the internet works in terms of monetization. Currently, it's done on an advertising model because people are products and being farmed. If we can build on Nostr and push this out, and we can if people are willing to move. If people are willing to move to Nostr, we can make it happen. We go back to the way the web was intended to be monetized at the beginning, which was peer-to-peer. And it will completely eliminate a lot of the creeping surveillance and control and gaslighting and propagandizing that we're faced with. The third technology that I think is really key here is eCash. So I'm wearing a shirt. This is a shirt from the Bitcoin ++ event that happened a couple of days ago in Berlin, which is fitting because people in Berlin have always been very pro-cash. But essentially, Lisa Nifty had put together an incredible event there with about 200 people building on this new technology. And just very simply, eCash is symbiotic with Nostr. It's symbiotic with Bitcoin, but it's a completely different technology. And it's an old technology. It was created in the 1980s. And basically the idea is to have peer-to-peer, unstoppable, untraceable cash. And at the beginning, we didn't have Bitcoin, so people tried to build it using US dollars. And basically you would deposit your US dollars into an eCash account, and then you had these like private credits that you could trade around. And this was done in the late 80s and early 90s through a company called DigiCash and a bunch of other products and experiments. Ultimately, this stuff didn't work because the US dollar is a permissioned system. So like to spread eCash back then, you had to work with the banks and you had to get their permission. And ultimately they didn't want to do it, right? Or the governments pressured them not to. But we had a chance to normalize cash on the internet. Like think about what cash is. If I pay you with cash, you don't know who I am or anything about me, and that's fine. I paid you for your service, or I bought goods from you, and that should be totally normally fine. And throughout most of human history, that was normal. Today, it's become not normal because I don't pay you with cash anymore. I use a credit that's tracked and programmable and instantly sold to third parties. It's been a total disaster. So the eCash dream was to have literally the same qualities of cash, that it's private and somewhat of a freedom tool, but on the internet. Now, the cool part is it didn't work very well with fiat as the base, but it works really well with Bitcoin as the base, largely because Bitcoin is permissionless. You can just go and build and no one's going to stop you. So the eCash movement is thriving on Bitcoin. There's two implementations. One is called Fediment, one is called Cashew. Then there'll be more, but they're one is federated and community oriented, and the other one is single party. And they're different, but they achieve the same general ideas that people can deposit Bitcoin into these mints, and then you get this incredible privacy technology. You get cash. It can be used offline, and it can do a lot of things Bitcoin can't do. So look, we'll see what happens with Bitcoin and forks and Bitcoin's evolution down the road. The point is, no matter how much Bitcoin evolves or upgrades or forks, it will never be able to do some of the things that eCash can do. So I think eCash is like going to be this great complementary technology. And I think with Bitcoin and Nostr and eCash, we kind of have this stack of being able to sort of challenge this idea of government control over money, debasement, inflation, central banking on the one hand, privacy on the internet with transactions on the other, with eCash, and then finally control over our own communications and social networks. So if these things can be invested in and grown, I think we can challenge the crises we have. I think we'll be so much stronger, because right now it feels like a pit of despair sometimes. You log in or you look at your news app or you turn on the TV and it's just like, how is this happening? How is this possible? But I think if we arm ourselves appropriately with these kind of liberation technologies, I mean, I absolutely think we can make the world a much better place. I have never been more optimistic, despite, again, the torrent of like crazy, depressing stuff coming at me every day.
Because with technology, you can scale, and these tools scale freedom.
Yeah, and we still need the old school physical interpersonal dynamics, and technology is nothing without people. So we still need mobilization of people, for sure. But if you have basically the unstoppable mobilization of the human spirit on the one hand, and then you have these tools, I mean, it kind of makes them superheroes. If we all are sovereign over our value, our labor, our wages, and we can store that in a way that no one can steal from us, and we can do that privately, and we can communicate on our own terms and build networks that we control, we are way harder to stop than if we are plugged into some CBDC censorship database, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if we could fight our way out of that world over there on our own. I think we need this technology to help us. I mean, if you think very simply, it's like, think about a naked human or a human that's in like a armor or has clothing on. I mean, we can withstand freezing winters and boiling summers because of the technology we've created. Well, guess what? The digital world is filled with nightmares and is filled with dystopia and is filled with surveillance and control. And we're going to need armor to survive. And I think we have it, right? So in the same way that humans created all kinds of technology to allow us to live in different places and to outlive the life expectancies of our forefathers and to fight disease and to travel the world and even now explore space, we're going to need the same kind of innovation and ingenuity to make sure we're free on the internet as digital, in the digital world. It's so important. But the good news is it's happening, and anyone can get involved, right? Anyone can get involved in any of these technologies, and I think they're so important to support. And again, anybody can access these things. They're not permissioned. You don't need a particular set of ID. So you could be building out of and look, let's be optimistic. Let's say the Taiwanese people retain their freedom, and we can get rid of Netanyahu, and there can be real peace in the Middle East, and like the Palestinians can rebuild and the Lebanese can rebuild, and let's say Putin gets beaten back and the Ukrainians can rebuild. Like, they're going to need this stuff. They're going to be in shambles. Their countries will have been destroyed. Their economic activity will have been destroyed. They'll still be cut off for many years. War does unimaginably bad things, right? But they'll be able to connect to these networks. They'll be able to save and use the best money in the world, and they won't be able to be discriminated against. And that's so inspiring and empowering. I mean, one of the craziest stories I heard was we organized something called the Global Bitcoin Summit a few weeks ago in Nashville with Bitcoiners from more than 60 countries. And one of the participants is from Lebanon. His name is Marco, and he founded Bitcoin du Liban. So he's the organizer of a community and an educational movement in Lebanon that helps people learn about Bitcoin. And it's helped so many people. It helped him survive hyperinflation, right? 5, 6, 7 years ago. And he was supposed to come, and then he emails us a week before saying, due to Israeli airstrikes, I had to flee with my family. We almost got bombed, and I had to escape, and I can't come to the United States. They've canceled all flights. We're just trying to survive. And he ends up sending us a video of him, and you can see the air mattress behind him. Obviously, he's relocated to somewhere, and he's cramped in with his family, and he's just trying to get by. But he gets on there and he's like brimming with optimism. And it was so infectious, because he's like, hey, everybody, what's happened to us is very hard. And I'm not going to lie about that. But, he was so excited about what technology made possible. So essentially with Bitcoin, he was able to bring all of his savings with him, even though he had to flee in the middle of the night. They had mere minutes to leave. And guess what? He was able to bring everything with him, essentially. All of his value came with him. And he was so optimistic about what this could mean for other people, even in the worst even in the worst conflict zones, in the most darkest parts of the world, he was so optimistic and it was so infectious. So we started the conference with this video from him. And at the end of the conference, our president, Céline, is Lebanese. And she had been working with Marco, going back and forth over those 2 days. And they found this awesome humanitarian organization that they vetted. Because a lot of humanitarian orgs waste money. And they're middlemen, and they're not... you send $1, maybe 40 cents gets to where it needs to go. But they found this awesome grassroots-based Lebanese organization that was helping people who were out in the street, helping people rebuild, helping people get by. And we were able to set up, using the help of Anita Posh and many others who were there, an easy-to-use Bitcoin wallet. So they were able to get that set up, and HRF was able to send over a bunch of support. And then we put up the QR code on the screen in front of the audience, and we were all able to permissionlessly send value using liberation technology to this group. On the other side of the world, we didn't have to ask a bank for permission. We didn't have to, wait for something to process or transact. It was just we had direct action. And it was so amazing to watch because it showed you how we can directly get involved from anywhere. So using these kind of technologies, I really do feel like we can connect with each other better. We can build the bridges that we need. There's way too many walls in the world. We can unite, we can collaborate, we can empathize, we can humanize. And that's really what needs to be done. Because again, I know most people listening are like tired and exhausted from what they're watching on the media, one way or another, depending on what perspective they have. They can't stand it. And they feel like the world's just going into this dark place. And I'm telling you that those are real stories. You do need to be empathetic and humanize with what you're seeing. But don't be black-pilled. Like, this is a white pill moment. Like, we have the power to change everything, and you got to join us. It's so important.
Well, these tools aren't just important for people living under tyranny. They're important for you and I.
Everybody.
I mean, we've had this slide into these technologies that, you talked about, the likes of Mao would have loved to have access to, but actually our governments are...
You're British.
I know.
Britain is a police state.
Yeah, Britain is a police state. We have...
it's a democratic police state.
Yeah.
But you have elections, but you're all spied on.
Yeah, elections, but I think it's an illusion of democracy in that we have democracy, but democracy for me isn't about the vote anymore because it makes a little fucking difference.
Well, it's about power of communities versus the state. Right?
Well, I can stand outside down the street and I can protest if I want.
But you can also get jailed for a tweet if you say it the wrong way.
Yeah, you can get jailed for a tweet, but I can also run for office.
Yes.
And I won't be shot.
No, let's not... that's so important for us to hold on to. Like, I'm always in arguments with people about this, and I'm always like, would you rather be in Texas or Tibet? Come on. Like the regardless of the outcome of our way of life, like, clearly we've built structures where people are more free to do what they want to do and can pursue more of what they want to pursue. So, my position is to let's focus on reforming our own societies, fixing where we've gone wrong, and empowering other people. Let's not go black-pilled on everything that we've achieved. And the worst is just to say, screw what we've built in terms of Western civilization and classic liberalism, and let's go support some dictator. I mean, I think that's the worst possible idea. That's going backwards, being primitive. This idea that let's support a strong man who can make all these decisions for us. I understand it's appealing. Populism's always been appealing. But that's never going to work out in the end. There's no such thing as a benevolent dictator in the end. There will always be a time when that person goes away, and then what next? It's going to be their son. And maybe their son's not so nice. The most important thing is for us to set up a society where there's checks and balances, and we can protect our freedoms regardless of who's in power. And I think these technologies I'm outlining are such good ways for us to do that. We need both. We need the classic ways for us to be involved in government and in governance, whether it's in your town or village or community or at the nation state level. But we also need these technologies. We need both. Both are so important.
It's very important that you don't lose this, okay? This is your inheritance through Bitcoin.
Let Bitcoin rip. Don't rip up your Bitcoin. Set up inheritance with Casa.
Well, I think the Bitcoin side is super important domestically.
Absolutely.
We had a super unpopular conservative government. very obviously we're going to lose the election to Labour, and Labour's popularity, the speed at which they've fallen out of favour already, has been very quick. And I think there's this kind of nihilism that's creeping into the UK. But I put it back down mostly, not everything, but a lot of it's down to the money. I mean, we are a country absolutely drowning in debt, and the only solutions that any party have has been more taxation and more borrowing and more inflation, and there's just been like erosion of the middle class. Everyone senses it. I mean, everyone in the UK senses it. Nobody believes in politics or politicians anymore. So that's where that kind of black pill nihilism comes from. But like, I'm with you.
Lifeboat.
Well, but it is. So it's that communication getting out to people, and then it becomes super depressing where you see someone like Elizabeth Warren attacking Bitcoin and wanting to regulate it. And I think you fucking need to sit down with Alex and talk about the work.
Well, it's funny just because she's spent her career fighting the banks.
Yeah.
It's like, well, here's the thing that allows people to be their own bank. So she just has a misunderstanding of it, but I don't think it's fixable. I think she's so paid off, and her information environment has been built around her by the existing system. The banks have built the memos she receives and the news she watches and the books she reads and the conversations she has. So there's just no real world where she's going to get it, I don't think. I think she's too far gone. Maybe I'm wrong. But it is ironic that she hates Bitcoin so much, and yet it's the one technology that can do what she says she's been fighting for her whole life, which is to fight back against the exploitative banking system. It is literally the thing that's doing that, and she can't see it. But I think that's to be expected. And look, people are going to, about these freedom technologies, whether it be Bitcoin, Nostr, eCash, and encrypted messaging tools, which are a core part of this, whether it be Signal or Simplex. I mean, they're all going to be attacked by the establishment. Of course, we've seen Bitcoin be attacked mercilessly by every government. Neil Kashkari, who's part of the Fed board, was attacking it today or this morning.
Saying it's got no value.
Saying it's got no value. He said this 6 months ago. And that's not ignorance. He knows better. That's malice. Like he's got an agenda to do, to basically paint it in a bad light. I mean, basically the mainstream media has been for a decade plus been saying Bitcoin's dangerous and risky and bad for the environment, when obviously quite the opposite is true. And they've done the same thing against privacy on the internet. Like, oh, it's for white supremacists or terrorists or bad people. I mean, they've been doing this since the early 90s. That was the whole thing at the beginning with Senator Biden and President Clinton in the early 90s. They were trying to say that the U.S. government needed a backdoor into every communication because we don't trust the bad guys. Privacy's for bad guys is what they were saying. Thankfully, a coalition of businesses and activists defeated them, and the U.S. became a safe place for encryption, more or less. And now you have even like the head spook, Michael Hayden, who used to be head of the NSA. I mean, he was saying that every American has the right to encrypt. So the culture war was like largely won on that front, but it's still tough, man. I mean, Simplex, which is a great messenger, which really is about as distant from your ID as possible in terms of your ability to create anonymous identities and message with each other. They were attacked the other day for being a white supremacist platform. And it's going to keep coming. So the attacks on privacy, the attacks on encryption, the attacks on Bitcoin. Nostr was attacked. I mean, Nostr was attacked in the mainstream media, again, for having they doxed the founder of it and called it a far-right platform. It's completely ridiculous. I mean, he's a computer programmer. So the mainstream media is going to attack these technologies as undesirable, as aggressive, as radical, whether it be left or right. They'll find some way to make it distasteful and to scare people. And these technologies are going to be, basically the scapegoat of a government that is increasingly desperate to hold on to power in wherever part of the world. And you just need to educate yourself about them and push them forward, because it's not going to be an easy or straightforward path. We have to do it together. And we're going to be attacked for it. I mean,
but this is why we need a strong and large independent media. So I mean large, like a large volume of content from a large volume of producers, but strong in the strength to actually deal with these subjects honestly and with integrity.
I love it. I mean, that's been one of the good things about the digitization of our society has been the ability of people to have a voice and to have so many different kinds of perspectives now. Whereas we used to have like what was in the broadsheet and what was on TV and what was on radio. Mm-hmm. And maybe you could fight your way in and get your opinion in. But today it's like Tons of people don't even get their information from mainstream sources anymore.
Well, there's a lot of trust in it as well. I mean, the BBC has struggled in the UK. And look, I'm not a complete hater of the BBC. I think if you wanted to consume mainstream media, if you took a little bit from the BBC, a little bit from Sky News, a little bit of independent media, you could start to form an opinion, and you would know what they're strong at and weak at. But there's been a complete loss of faith in the BBC over the last,
look at the New York Times. Complete loss of faith. So from different perspectives.
Of course.
Look, but the thing is, look, good journalists still work for these outlets. Yes. They still do good work in some areas. You have to build up your sense-making abilities to figure out, what seems like a good, accurate, good report that seems to be done in good faith, and what's propaganda. And you got to be able to build up your sense-making. It's very important in this day and age. But the good news is, look, we've got so many different possible news sources now that you can really hear from every different perspective, and it's quite the time. It's quite a time to be alive from that perspective. You have to train yourself to figure out what's good and what's what's poor info. But if you can do it, man, there's such a wealth of info out there, and it's right at our fingertips. So that's something we can use. That's quite exciting, and I think that can play into this technology stack that I'm talking about, where creators can get paid and they can't get deplatformed, right? And they can get paid in money that can't be stopped. And people can build up networks that are resistant to censorship. And, we can have privacy and communicating and sharing ideas. So, without this the freedom tech stack, we would be toast. We'd totally toast. We'd be completely devalued, deplatformed, and censored. But we aren't, right? Because we know how to use Bitcoin, and we know how to use Nostr, and we know how to use eCash. That's, I think, where we're going to be in 5 to 10 years. And we're not going to be devalued, and we're not going to be deplatformed. We are gonna we'll be resilient. And when I say we, I mean anybody. That's the coolest part. It could be anybody in any of these conflict zones or places that I've mentioned. All three of these technologies are open to business to anybody. It's just so important.
Do you as an organization have to think much, or have you thought much about AI, the role of AI, how it's being used to oppress people now, or the potential to oppress, and vice versa? Can it act as a freedom technology as well?
Yeah, look, we put together an event at Stanford University in 2019 and 2020 about how the Chinese government was using, let's say AI or big data analysis to oppress its people and to sort of have a micro live real-time understanding of what's happening and then be able to control it. And it was terrifying. And obviously it's way worse today. So I think in the hands of authoritarian regimes, like AI is unquestionably a bad development. However, we can fight back. And I do think that open source AI tools are really powerful in the hands of individuals. I don't think it's quite like black and white. There is some truth to the idea that like AI is authoritarian and Bitcoin is pro freedom. But I think that open source AI can be quite powerful for people. Obviously, in the same way that if you are a person who now has access to the internet and all the world's knowledge, you're much more empowered than before. If you have access to some of these really powerful AI tools, you could be much more powerful, right? You could be empowered. The key is the permission, whether they're gated, whether they're controlled. So I think the open source ones are really interesting. So I think that open source AI is going to end up becoming, part of the human rights arsenal. I think it's a little early, but it probably ends up becoming part of this, freedom tech stack that I'm talking about.
Yeah, I'm taking a bit of a look at something like Venice, which
it's just so early.
Yeah, it's so early.
But I think 10 years from now, there will be open source AI tools that individuals can use around the world to meaningfully improve their lives, even as the closed source proprietary AIs help authoritarians oppress people. I find it hard to believe we can get away from that framework.
Are you seeing that already?
Again, that's what I'm saying. Like governments are using AI to automate repression. At scale, at large scale. Again, you guys don't have a constitution, but you have a network of surveillance cameras that, can find targets very, very quickly. Even if they're not online, because the physical spaces in Britain are now, at least in London, are so surveilled. I mean, that's using essentially, big data analysis to do that, right? So that's pretty chilling.
But it's quite interesting. I had Silky Carlo on the show.
Big Brother Watch.
Yeah, she's
awesome,
amazing, and she was talking about how they've been rolling these out in London, but they are particularly bad with identification of black people.
Well,
and so people are being arrested accidentally,
sure.
but due to misidentification by
there will
these
be a lot of victims on the road to to rolling out these AIs and these CBDCs and all these authoritarian tools. But I do have faith in the open source AI stuff. I think it could be powerful in the hands of people. How
much success has there been in rolling out these CBDCs? And just for the people listening, these are central bank digital currencies. These are the final weapon for governments to have full control over our money and surveil us.
The ultimate, where they really want to go.
Because you set up the goal. Yeah, because you guys set up the tracker, right?
Yeah, we have a CBDC tracker you can go to. It's like href.org/CBDC tracker. You can go there and you can see the status of a CBDC in your country. On the one hand, it's scary because, more than 120 governments are researching them. More than 50 have built a pilot, literally have built a CBDC. And more than 20 have rolled a CBDC out in some way to the public, including big countries like China and Nigeria and Russia. Okay, so we're talking about billions of people who now live in a society with CBDCs. So that's the scary part. That's the bad part. That's why we need to be on the offensive against them, and that's why we need to be promoting Bitcoin and eCash adoption.
Just a couple of questions on that. Those that have rolled them out, do they integrate with the traditional rails, or are they brand new rails themselves?
Yeah, the general idea of a CBDC is to weaken the private sector's role in money and strengthen the state's role in money. So the idea being you can have a wallet on your phone that has liabilities directly from the central bank. Now, they may be intermediated or provided by some large private bank, but the idea is the credits are direct liabilities of the government instead of credits of Visa or Lloyd's or whatever. The idea is the British central bank, instead of issuing notes, would issue digital notes on your phone. Again, they may be intermediated or provided by insert name of bank here, but it's more state control, more state awareness, and more state ability to do things like negative interest rates, expiration dates on your wages. You can only have so much meat or oil or whatever, or fuel for your car, that sort of thing. I mean, that's what's happening in China for sure. So the bad news is these are coming, and governments will force them. The good news is people don't like them.
Mm-hmm.
So wherever they've been rolled out, there's been merchants don't like them, individuals don't like them. So there is resistance, and that's good to see. But
have any failed?
Yeah, there's been some. I think Colombia just recently said it's giving up and throwing its CBDC project in the trash. And there's a few others that you can read about. But I mean, the trend is more and more and more. And the digital euro seems to be totally happening at some point, at some level. Now, can we fight back and make it not the worst thing in the world? Maybe, but people in dictatorships have no ability to do that. Maybe in America and in Europe, people can protest and get the CBDCs to have some sort of privacy. I have no idea. I mean, they're certainly not going to peg it to Bitcoin, right? So there's going to be inflation and devaluation no matter what. But maybe there could be privacy in the West. There's not going to be privacy from the government in authoritarian countries. They would never build freedom technology, right? So that's why in the end that stuff like Bitcoin and eCash matters so much. But ultimately, people are resisting the CBDC rollout, but governments can force people to comply. And that's what they're doing in places like Nigeria and even in the Bahamas, which has been one of the places, I guess, weirdly, that's had a CBDC the longest. It's like the sand dollar or something like that. But they're now going to be forcing merchants to use it with threat of penalties and violence. So even in small countries, when they try to roll these things out, people don't want it. They're going to force people to use it. So, I mean, I think, again, positive is that people are resisting. Negative is that governments want these things. But ultimately, that's why the tech stack I've mentioned is so important. We can push back against it.
Yeah, got to keep pushing it out there. Okay, well, listen, appreciate you as ever.
Thank you for having me on, man. Yeah. And
anything we didn't cover today you wish we had?
No, just look, stay positive.
Mm-hmm.
It's the only way we can change the world to the way we'd like it. We'd like it to get to. You got to find some way of like channeling all this stuff you see into positive change, and it's going to make you angry and frustrated. That's basic human emotion. Seeing this stuff, seeing these conflicts, seeing this devastation, genocide, war. I mean, it's horrible. But try to like, convert that anger into something. Like do something. Reach out to someone. If you're working on Bitcoin or Nostr or some sort of technology like this, eCash, encrypted messaging, keep doing what you're doing because it's so important, because it's going to help empower people even in these places. Like think about the story I told about our friend Marco in Lebanon. Like these technologies can have a huge impact even in the most perilous places. So keep building, keep fighting. Honored to be here on the new show. Excited to see where it goes. Hopefully we can get some of these ideas into the minds of more and more people. So appreciate you having me on.
I appreciate you, man. Well, listen, I thank you for involving me in the work that the HRF has done over the years, and the invites to Oslo. I've been twice now with you. No, three times.
We're coming back.
Yeah, so I apprecight that, and just keep doing your thing, man. It's incredible to watch. I've learned so much from you.
Well, you're not as obnoxious as they say you are.
I know, I'm not obnoxious. All right, thank you,
Peter.
Thank you, everyone listening.